right. Well, welcome back to the Psych Guys podcast. This is actually a topic that I've done on my other podcast, Talk Mental Health with Dr. Logan Noone. Quick shameless plug. But it's an unfortunate situation that happens every freaking year. And it seems like, in my opinion, it doesn't seem like it's getting better. I don't know. I'm interested to hear kind of your experiences. We're going to be talking about the match process and when the match process for medical school graduates doesn't go super smoothly. It eventually ended successfully for you. You got a psych spot, right? And that doesn't even happen for everybody. There are more medical school graduates than there are residency slots. So unfortunately, some graduates don't even get a spot. It's bullshit. It makes me so angry, so frustrated. These students are sacked with, sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars of student loans, and they can't even work. So, I know you had a really tough time with your experience getting matched with your match process. I'm really stoked to hear this story. So let's kind of dive in. So you were going to medical school in West Virginia, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And so just so, this episode is probably going to attract a lot of medical students. When you were applying to psychiatry, of course, it's kind of becoming a more competitive field. Were you all in psychiatry or done, or did you kind of hedge your bets, family medicine, transitional year, like internal med with it? How did you do that?
Yeah. So for me, I was very interested in psychiatry in med school. When I did do a neurology rotation and also started getting interested in that. So I was a little torn at one point, but then ultimately I was like, you know what? I've been interested in psychiatry for a long time. I have an interest in addiction medicine and just felt like, that's what I need to do. And I did put in some applications for neurology, but essentially the majority of my applications I put in were psychiatry. And I did not, in the original match, I put in a lot of applications because I knew going into it that I was not the most competitive of candidates. And
can you put a number on it?
Over 100. Yeah. Possibly over 150. I can't quite remember. Which is expensive. But I knew I had to put the numbers in, and I did not put in any family medicine, internal medicine applications for the first part of the match. And ultimately for me, I ended up with like 4 psychiatry interviews and 1 neurology interview. And then it was very disheartening, just every single week getting emails saying, we're not offering you an interview, or weeks of not hearing anything. Not like the first couple weeks, I think I got a couple of the interviews. I got emails that I got a couple interviews, and I got really excited and was like just like waiting, like hoping to see some of these interviews start pouring in, and then that did not happen. And so then I went into the match, and I can't remember the schedule. It is like, what do you typically find out on a Monday? Is that when it happens?
At least the first part, and then on the Friday you find out where. Yeah,
so that Monday, waking up, and whenever it happens, like I don't remember if it happens at like 9 or noon or whatever, got the email that said like you didn't match. And honestly, the feeling was just kind of like, fuck. Well, what now? And they had a meeting for us. Like I got an email that basically said like I had to attend a meeting that basically everybody in my program,
from your medical school.
Yeah, anyone that didn't match had to attend it, where they basically talked about what happens now. And they walked us through the SOAP process, that we would be getting these like, tokens or whatever that you submit. I think we got like 40 or 50. I feel like it was 40 of these like tokens that and then they would tell us that I think it was like Tuesday, maybe it was like Tuesday night, like a list comes out of all the open spots in the country. And then you have like 40 tokens that you can essentially send your application to like 40 places. And actually, like, I ended up like screwing up and like sent a couple to like the wrong thing. Like it wasn't like the categorical program, and actually sent it to like a different, like a fellowship program or something like that. And then like I emailed like the ERAS system or whatever the system is, and they were like, "Oh, we can't give you those back." And I was like, again, it was just like, well, fuck,
wow.
like, and I essentially, used all my tokens for the psych programs, used some for neurology, and then felt like I had to throw some in for like transitional years and IM programs and family medicine programs. Some of the places that I was interested in, like the psych programs, I put in like FM and IM spots to those programs with the thought of, if I can get in there for like IM or FM, then maybe I can like, get to know the psych programs there and then possibly transition into them. So yeah, then I think on Wednesday, then you can start. I forget the exact itinerary for that week, but yeah, you get the list, you put in your applications, and then you start finding out about interviews. And I actually ended up with more interviews during the SOAP than I got during the initial match. Like I said, I got like 4 interviews during the initial match. I ended up with like 6 interviews during the SOAP process. I think I only ended up with like 1 psych interview, I think like 1 neurology interview, and the rest were IM and FM interviews. And so then there's like, with the SOAP, there's like rounds to it. And I think there was like 3 rounds where you like, I think it's a Thursday where you like find out, they do the first round and then the second round and the third round. And again, it was just like each round just finding out that I didn't place. And again, it was just very, very disheartening. At the time, I was just like, I had like, picked up a pack of cigarettes, unfortunately, and was just chain smoking and pounding coffee and just like talking to anybody that would listen to me, like in my support group, in my network of people that I just go to for advice. And it took a lot of venting and a lot of frustration. It was a very scary time, wasn't sleeping well. And so then essentially I had to do the scramble. The scramble, you get the same list that you keep getting these lists, these updated lists of like how many spots are left in the country of like the different subspecialties. And so I go in to do the scramble. I think like with the scramble, you get the list like Thursday night. And so Thursday night, I got the list and I essentially like emailed every single program on that list, for like IM and FM, neurology, whatever was left, emailed them all, like, essentially made like a draft of a copy and paste email to all these programs, and then woke up early Friday morning and just started calling these places. And I ended up scrambling into a program, an IM program out in Long Beach, California. And, I had to make that decision, like, do I take this spot? Do I, essentially like hold off and just like do like a research year and then reapply the following year? And, unfortunately, I think that's stuff that just is up to like the individual to figure out on their own. For me, after talking to a lot of people, I just felt like the best thing would be to just take a spot. Like getting into residency was better than having to like hold off on another year. And it's tough because when I went into medicine, I went into it, you know, thinking like, yeah, like there's competitive specialties out there, but didn't go into it with the thought of like, oh, if I'm interested in something like psychiatry, that there's a possibility I might not get to do that. Like, I just kind of thought, you know, some of these other specialties that, you know, I was not as aware of like how competitive and brutal the match process can be. So I I scrambled into this program, this IM program, and not going to mention its name or anything like that, but like actually back when I signed the contract, they were paying their residents $40,000 a year.
Oh, wow.
To live, and that was to live in Long Beach, California.
Yeah, math doesn't add up here.
And I signed it. I was just like, hey, it's something, you know. Actually, after I signed it, I found out like they actually ended up getting a significant raise.
Oh, okay.
And which was great for them. Because like there was like residents at that program that were just literally taking out loans so that they could pay rent.
Wow, boy.
Yeah. But what ended up happening for me was the dean, we ended up getting a new dean at my program, like my third year. And she had some connections up here in Jersey, and specifically some through like the Rowan med school. And she emailed me and said, I know about a program that didn't get approval for accepting residents until after the match happened. And like they just got approval. And she was like, this is the program. She said, you know, I know you've kind of come to terms with the fact that you did get into a program. I know it wasn't what you wanted, but she basically said, from her experience, that there was a little bit of different rules with like the match versus the soap versus the scramble, where she said she knew of people in the past that scrambled into a program that then
were able to get out of the contract.
Yeah. And so I emailed the Inspira Vineland psych program, got an interview, ended up interviewing, and then got a phone call like 10, 15 minutes after the interview was over, and was offered a spot. And I won't forget that
euphoria,
that conversation.
What was that like?
It was just like, to have somebody call me and be like, how would you like to be a psychiatrist? I was just like, it was definitely. Was
that the big man, Big Steve-O?
It was, yeah.
Big Steve-O.
It was just like, and I actually didn't tell them that I had scrambled into another program. Mm-hmm. And I was like, I am super happy to hear that. I do have to tell you now, like I did scramble into this other program. I want to be a psychiatrist. And so he told me right then and there, like, he was like, okay, well, we want you, but, this could end up being a problem. Like, you need to talk to them and see what's going to happen. And so the way I approached it was I called the program in California. I talked to the program director, and I essentially said, this fell into my lap. This is what I want to do. I want to do psychiatry. If I am very aware that you all decide if you're going to let me out of the contract or not. And if you decide not to let me out of the contract, then I will show up on day one and be a happy, productive member of the team. And, I signed the contract. If you all say, no, we're not letting you out, then I understand. And I will, accept that responsibility. I'm not going to, kick and scream. I will show up and be a good resident. And she was like, let me give you a call back. And she called me back and she said, yeah, we want people to be happy at our program. We want everybody to be happy. We want you to be happy. And so we'll let you out of the contract. And, you know, I felt very fortunate that I went from essentially just feeling lost to then feeling like, okay, well, whatever happened, it seemed like I was going to end up in a program with some good administrators, some good leadership that wanted their people to be happy. And so, you know, luckily it worked out. They let me out of the contract, and I was able to sign the contract to be a psych resident. And again, well, the program I got into is a new program. So I'm part of an inaugural group of residents. I'm a PGY2 now. So last year was my first year, and I have 2 other co-residents, and yeah, we were the first to be part of a new program. And that in itself has been interesting and been fun because psychiatry has become a lot more competitive, and residency in general is getting a lot more competitive. And there's only so many residency spots available that I am proud to be in a program that is trying to be part of the solution of, you know, creating new programs to kind of help accommodate all these new residents that, and especially like psychiatry, since it's becoming more and more competitive.
Right. You know, so I had a good friend who had to go through the SOAP, and he like you know, eventually got lucky and got a spot. But in that episode I was referring to on my other podcast, one thing he really described a lot is he's like, I had both the best moment of getting that spot, but also some of the lowest moments in my life throughout. It was like this emotional roller coaster throughout the whole week. Simultaneously, he also felt that, you know, although, and I'm sure every school is kind of different. Some schools have a lot of students that don't match. Like a lot of our international medical school student colleagues, unfortunately, have a higher, not unmatched rate than like Harvard, right? Or something. They probably match everybody. But so, you know, but all schools have some experience with this. But at least my friend felt that the school didn't do the best job supporting students throughout that experience. What was your experience like from an emotional standpoint?
I felt like my school was very supportive. And like I said, you know, we have a new dean that was like the new dean at my school, my 3rd year, who used to be a part of Rowan. And it was like my first time talking with her, and she was super supportive, and like, you know, and I did have a counselor through the school who I talked to a lot, who was very supportive. So emotionally, I felt like my school was very supportive, helping me through that process. You know, quite a few people like are like resident coordinator, the dean, like people like basically gave me their phone numbers and said, reach out to us anytime. Like if you just need to talk, like if you get good news, if you get bad news. And I did keep them in the loop. And there's times where I needed to call and talk to them about, you know, what do I do if I don't match? Like, what are my options? And I mean, I'm not going to lie, med school was tough for me. And I was feeling jaded. You know, I said I was not the most competitive of students. Like I struggled getting into med school. I didn't do great on the MCAT. I applied to med school 2 years in a row and didn't get in, and then got in the 3rd time. And then, you know, I had some other things that happened throughout med school. Like my father passed away very early on, actually the day before classes started. It was like the last day of orientation and like the first day before classes started. I mean, life happens. Life doesn't stop just because med school starts. And, you know, so it was a tough time for me, and I didn't excel the way I wanted to in med school. And so, you know, I ended up I had to take level 1 twice, you know, pass level 2. And and a lot of the programs that I wanted to audition at this was during COVID time, weren't accepting visiting auditioning students. And so it was a tough time. And I also, I don't know if you all relate to this or not, but I had some bad rotations in med school.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I was starting to feel jaded and was questioning, and it's,
where is my money going?
Exactly. Like, I was like, you go through the end of med school and you're at the end of it, you start wondering, is like, I've put so much time and energy into this, and then is this really what I want to do? And like not as a reflection of like my med school, but like some of it has to do with like the preceptors you have. Like sometimes you rotate with these preceptors that don't seem happy to be doctors.
Yeah.
And that's, and then you become a resident and you start learning like, oh, this is why some of them aren't happy to be doctors. Maybe they didn't get into the field they wanted to. Maybe the match didn't go well for them. And so you do start to understand things a little bit better. But, I started asking questions like, well, what if I just decide not to go to residency? Maybe being not even going into being a doctor. Like I started asking those questions, and they said, well, there's things you can do. There's like medical writing. There's like insurance. You can get jobs through insurance companies, those kinds of stuff.
Were those really viable options though? Given the loan burden that students typically carry.
I think in hindsight, it was a little bit more possibly like, would you consider it like reaction formation, almost like where it was like, I just started feeling like, you know what, if like the medical community doesn't want me, then maybe I don't want it, kind of a thing, like feeling rejected by not getting into the match, and like struggling every step along the way in regards to just like med school and it's a grind, but that being said, it did end up working out. I was able to get into a program and get into the program of like the specialty I wanted to do. And that in itself has been definitely a game changer, being able to finally kind of feel home somewhere in regards to like being able to focus my attention and my studying towards like what I actually want to do. Like that has been, it has definitely like not like invalidated like all of those thoughts that I was having of like, oh, do I even want to do this at this point? Like it was really just, the end of the grind of med school and it all kind of culminating in
it's like
the disappointment. Yeah. The disappointment of the match and everything like that. And now being on the other side of it and like actually getting to do what I want to do is, it's really kind of like been a breath of fresh air and kind of reaffirmed my desire and my passion for medicine and psychiatry.
Perhaps also your confidence too, that you will make a great psychiatrist. I know me and Joon both think you're going to make a fantastic psychiatrist.
Well, thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you. One thing that, I asked my good friend Ben, who he's now pursuing sports medicine as he graduates from his OMM residency. And I asked him a very similar question, like, how could this process be better? It's obviously like emotionally a wreck during that week, but he was able to get a spot, right? And so he kind of talked about how he's like, honestly, I don't even know if the school could have done more. I don't know if my friends necessarily could have done more because it's such a crazy week. It's like you're doing all of these interviews and emails from Monday through Friday. You're just like working like a crazy person for that whole week. So it makes me kind of think a lot, Paul, like you are, if you like this episode, if you've made it, 24 minutes in, please check out the other episode with Paul, because I'm very curious your experience with alcoholism, what lessons you learned that helped you better handle this obviously emotionally challenging time of your life.
Yeah. So that was something that like, I disclosed myself, like me being an alcoholic, in both my interviews to med school as well as like all my interviews to residency, because like I had to tell it. Like there's like so much of my life and my story revolves around my drinking and getting sober. Like there's things in my past that I have to explain, where if I don't explain it by basically telling the truth of like, you know, I had a downward spiral in my life where I was drinking and partying and ultimately got sober over 14 years ago, which then changed my trajectory of life. Without explaining that, there's parts of my life that just make me seem like a sketchy candidate, you know, like having like 3 semesters of college where I failed. I transferred to a lot of different colleges because for a while I was trying to do what we call these geographic cures of going to a different school and thinking things would be better. Yeah. But essentially I was just taking myself and my alcoholism to these other areas, these other schools, and just starting off where I left off. And so I had to explain it. And, you know, the positive thing I can say about it is like, you know, ultimately I ended up in a med school where I was honest with them about being in recovery and being a recovering alcoholic. They knew that about me and they accepted me. And I ended up in a residency where I was open with them about the exact same things, and they openly accepted me with full knowledge of that. And I did definitely, there was things I learned from being in recovery that did help me through the match. And a lot of that essentially had to be, you know, I'm not much of a spiritual person. But I do, one of the things I've learned in recovery is that when I try and sometimes I think I know what's best for me and I try and make that work. And if I try and step away from it and try and let things happen on their own, sometimes things end up turning out for the best. And I don't even have to like, sometimes I mess things up because I think I know what's best for me and I got to make this happen and I got to do this and this. And sometimes I just got to like allow the process to happen. And I definitely had to talk to a lot of people within my recovery network, get reminded. And I had to like let people know like, hey, I'm struggling right now. Like I wasn't thinking of taking a drink, but if I'm struggling with important things in life, like when my dad passed away, like the first people I called were people in recovery to let them know like, hey, I'm not thinking of picking up a drink, but like something horrible happened and I need you to know where I am at right now in case I do need to call you all. And I had to do the same thing with going through the match process, where finding out where I didn't match, I had to call people and basically say, this is what's going on. Like as of right now, my future in medicine is very precarious and I might not get to do what I want to do. And that is stressful. And I'm not thinking of picking up a drink right now, but I need other people in my network to know where I'm at in case I need help.
Yeah, I think this is one of the uglier sides of medicine, right? They never tell you when you are trying to go to med school that even after you get in, there's so many different potential points of heartbreak. I mean, it's extremely difficult. I mean, we could just look at the admission numbers, right? It's extremely difficult to even obtain a spot in med school. I can kind of relate to your story because I'm also a non-traditional student. It took me about 4 years of preparation to get accepted into one school. I had about 3 or 4 interviews and I got accepted to one school, Arkansas College of Osteopathic Medicine, shout out. So, you know, it's like you get in and then you do all this grinding, you go through all the BS, you pay all the money, and then after 4 years, after jumping through the hurdles and all the BS that comes your way during med school, there's a chance that you may not even achieve the ultimate goal that you set out for. So like, what is that? And then if you do get it, you go through this thing called residency, right? Also for several years. rates of burnout is extremely high in residency as well. So again, there's this possibility that you may get jaded real quick. And I was resonating super hard with what you were saying. There's days that, like even till this day, there's certain days where I'm just like, boy, did I make the right choice? And it even progresses to the point where I'm just like, man, I'm hundreds of $1,000s in debt. And even if I don't like it, I have no choice. This is what it is. This is what I've committed to. And I need to stay on this path for the next several decades. There's no other option for me. And certain times, that's a very heavy burden. So I think that's something that needs to be talked about more often. All the potential areas where you can have essentially your heart broken along the journey, right? It's not all glitz and glamour. And the reality of medicine is that, at the end of the day, it's a job. And just like with any other job, there's stressors, there's moments of extreme highs, but there's also moments of very lows. And you've so bravely come on this podcast, willing to share some of your journey. And I think a lot of students will find value in what you're saying. And Paul, if you can just share your experience, if you are able to go back in time, right? Are you able to tell us what would you do differently at each and every point? So first there's the match, and then there's the soap, and then there's the scramble. So 3 different stages that you go through to try to achieve this ultimate goal of matching into a residency spot. What would you have done differently, and what's your advice to students in each and every step?
Yeah, so unfortunately hindsight is 2020, and first of all, if I could do it all over again, I think the best thing to have done would have been to I think about this a lot. Like if I could do it all over again, essentially I would do a lot of the things in med school differently. Like, and the one of the issues with med school right now is, I think, and obviously I can't speak to the way things were, 20 plus years ago, but there's so many different ways to study in med school that it's really hard to pick what works for you. Because sometimes you don't figure it out until it's too late. And I think that's what happened to me. And again, like you said, like you like kind of prepared for like 4 years before going into like the process. I did not put as much work in research into it before going into it. And I come from like a medical family. Like my dad was a doctor, my brother's a doctor. And even with that being in my family, like there was a lot of things I did not know going into med school, like how important like the first aid book is, and like how important practice problems are and things like that. Like, and I was essentially doing what I was told to do in med school. And if I could do things all over again, like I would have been much more board focused from day one. Because unfortunately, I think that is, in a sense, like kind of part of the problem, but that is what we work with. Like, I went into it thinking like, if I go to class every day and do what I'm told to do, that everything's going to turn out all right. And that isn't exactly the case. And it's not like the school's fault. It's the system's fault.
And I disagree with that statement.
Oh, okay.
I disagree with that wholeheartedly. Sorry, go on.
Well, it's just like, yeah, like you have to be focused on boards from day one. And that's not really how I was like kind of told to approach it. And if I could do it over again, yeah, I would have had first aid like day one, been like studying that like hand in hand with like what I was studying for classes. I would have been doing practice problems from day one, and essentially like working on doing a better job of the level 1 exam, because I think that was like my biggest hurdle. And I know things are different now because like the level 1 is switched to a pass fail system. I don't really have much knowledge of like what the direction is going in now. I wish the system looked at like individuals more as a whole than so much of it being like a score on like one exam. And I hope that's the direction that we're heading in. But yeah, if I could do it all over again, I definitely would have, tried to work on improving my level 1 score from the very first try.
Yeah, it is kind of crazy to think about how that like is the one thing you come at it. You asked like, what would you do at different stages? And it's like, hey, well, if I just had if I didn't have to explain that I failed this one fucking test, I maybe wouldn't have even had to deal with the soap and scramble.
Pretty much.
And so here's my fucking soapbox. I do think the school is standing in the way of a lot of medical students to achieve that pass. I know when we all went through it, we actually had to score level 1 or step 1, which is, for the listeners who don't understand, it's like the big test, arguably the most important test of medical school. And I think we all can relate to how many professors did we have in medical school that would go off on these random tangents and rants that had nothing to do with our boards, or how many meaningless tasks in medical school did we have to go do that were just time inefficient, just like waste of time, right? And I just think a lot about how the medical school's objectives aren't always the same as the students' objectives. The students' objectives are to, of course, gain a residency spot. And so stupid to me because like a medical school with a high match rate for residents is going to attract more medical students, that is, excuse me. But, those professors maybe want to pump out research. Maybe they have their own passion they want to make sure their professors are happy so they don't leave. So yeah. I do think the medical school perhaps is part of the reason why you failed, because I think I knew students that said the same thing, and they frequently would attend the school classes closely. I didn't go to all the classes. I went to actually probably as little as I could. I only went to the required ones, and it allotted me time to study for boards. And I think that's maybe why I was able to pass and do okay. So I really, really kind of feel the schools need to have a reality check and realize that this model, this approach of lectures from 8 to 5 is not yielding the most beneficial outcome.
All right, I got to share my personal story as well on the topic of bashing med schools. My experience was, and this was mind-boggling to me. So literally one day they gave us a lecture on the science of studying, right? And it's hour-long lecture. It was amazing actually, and I agreed with many of the principles that were discussed. I forgot what the book was called, but there's a very famous book that goes through the science of learning and performance, and it was basically one of our lecturers basically gave a summary of it. And basically the core tenets was we have to study actively, meaning that it's all about questions, random questions, time questions, simulating test environment, right? And they said specifically in the lecture that science has shown that auditory passive learning is not really efficient, especially when it comes to retaining information. In fact, you feel like you're learning more, but when you actually take an exam, the people that were doing random questions who felt terrible as they were doing it actually performed much better than this other group that primarily did auditory learning, but they felt great while they were learning. They felt like they were actually getting something out of it, but the results showed something different. And then literally the next day, they're like, oh, we're going to have mandatory lectures. You have to come in and you have to listen for, 8 to noon, and then come back at 2 p.m., 2 to 5. And then the rest of the day, you can study however you want. But I felt like there was such a disconnect between the study behind the science of study and learning and the curriculum policies that the med school was actually putting forth. I don't know if that was just my unique experience at my med school. Maybe some other med schools are different. But also on the same kind of note, a lot of the advisors at my med school, they weren't physicians. I don't know what your experience was like, but my school, a lot of the advisors were just like PhD, like English majors, education.
English majors? They weren't even like science majors?
PhD English. Yeah.
What the fuck did they do?
I think our lead advisor was had a PhD background in English. So I found out very early on. I'm just like, these people have never really experienced medical school, so maybe
they can help you write a personal statement.
Yeah, maybe I should just ask somebody else. Yeah.
Yeah, I actually had because I know there's probably going to be people listening to this that are like can't imagine the fact that I didn't have first aid on the first day of school and wasn't doing practice problems like from the first day. And yeah, my med school, some of our professors who are similar to the kind that you're talking about that were PhDs and not physicians, some of them would actually talk about how much they didn't like first aid. And so I started thinking like, well, maybe I shouldn't be using this book that all the students are talking about. And they actually suggested against doing practice problems in your first year. They said, don't worry about that until second year. But in hindsight, yeah, I would have had first aid and a subscription to any kind of question bank starting from day one if I could do it all over again.
I don't think anybody who hasn't actually been through that experience recognizes how grueling that preparation process is, and also the level of importance for everybody that's involved and the level of competition that you face from your peers. I mean, it's almost like, if I know Logan isn't going to class and I know you're just cranking out board problems, I know at the end of the day, what's going to match me into residency, the most important thing is that board score. So by looking at Logan, that puts pressure on me like, oh, shoot, maybe I also shouldn't be attending class. So I feel like there's this, like this oxymoron dynamic going on in med school where administrators are pushing for one type of learning modality, but then all the pressure, all the students recognize that the pressure and all the high stakes are geared towards this totally opposite direction.
It almost sounds like they have self-serving interest.
Right?
Maybe trying
and that our interests do not align.
Maybe trying to protect their jobs. Me and my friends used to always joke about like, is there going to be one day a world of at least maybe the first 2 years of medical school are online? I think there could be. I definitely think there could be. No, I think the clinical experiences are immensely important, but in the world we live in now, I think it's definitely possible. Changing subjects. I also imagine. Now, okay, look, I'll talk out of my personal experience, and then it is a question. Rowan, if you're listening, I love you. You weren't my first choice. And I was a little disappointed that I didn't get, I think we all can relate. I didn't get as many interviews as I thought I was going to get. I think we all can relate to that. And I remember thinking a lot about, I disclosed very similar to you, that I have bipolar disorder. And I thought a lot about, well, shit, maybe that's why I'm not getting as many interviews outside of my academic, inachievements, lack of achievements, perhaps. I can't even speak, right? It's probably why I ended up at Rowan. but also maybe they were like, well, what if this guy has a manic episode while he's on our residency? I thought a lot about that. But there's one thing you said earlier that really resonated with me, and I talk a lot about this because I get a lot of students asking me, like, should I disclose my substance use history? Should I disclose my experience with PTSD or whatever it may be? And I actually kind of say you shouldn't, unless you can't tell your story without saying it.
Yeah.
Like earlier you said, like, I felt like I had to tell it. I felt very similarly. Like I advise, don't disclose wounds, only disclose scars. You really have to be in a good healed space. And if you can't tell your story without that part of the equation, if you feel you're lying, being disingenuous, then I do think disclosure is imperative and necessary, right? Because I was like, yeah, what am I supposed to be, this random insurance salesman who thought all of a sudden he should go to med school? Like, I have to disclose my personal experience with this illness. Did you have those same thoughts? I imagine you did the week you didn't match. Like, well, shit, maybe I shouldn't have told them I was an alcoholic.
Yeah, my mind didn't really go there. I do relate to what you said. Like I talked to people when it came to, like, when I was applying to med school, I talked to a lot of physicians that I knew, and because I was working in a drug and alcohol treatment center at the time that had physicians that worked there, and talked with some of them and reached out to some physicians in recovery and talked to them. And honestly, the majority of the answers I got was kind of similar to what you said. Like, they basically said, like, don't disclose yourself unless there's no other way. And basically there was no other way for me. Like, I had to explain my past. And that was the best way to explain it, was to be open. And I mean, I would never suggest lying about anything when it comes to like admissions and, statements and personal letters and things like that. But for me, like, I had to be upfront and honest and put that forward to explain my past. But yeah, my mind didn't really go there when I didn't match right away. Like, it didn't go to, oh, I wonder if this was because of me being open about being an alcoholic. It definitely went more to like the fact that of just knowing in my heart that like I was not a competitive candidate to begin with. And so much of that coming from feeling like I started off med school on like the wrong foot of not being so board focused. Like in med school, there's like this constant like debate of like, is it better to like work on being like a well-rounded physician, or is it better to like be focused on the boards? And when I started med school, I would have said wholeheartedly that I thought that the important thing was to like learn to be a good, well-rounded physician in med school. But by the end of med school and then not matching right away, I would completely say now that the best thing to do is to be board focused from the very beginning.
Yeah, that's interesting too, because now it's I'm sure there's med students listening who are like, well, yeah, but level 1 is pass fail. And I feel the head organizations of residency, they feel like they solved the problem, but in reality, I feel they just punted it to the next year.
Oh yeah.
Now step 2 is just arguably the new step 1. And what I mean by that, it's the pivotal test. If you fail step 2, or don't get a very good score, it's going to be that much more challenging. I wish it was different, right? I wish it was more dealing with well-rounded physicians and all this other humanistic aspects that are, of course, important. But I do think it all just comes down to the fundamentals, what we talked about at the beginning of the show. When there is a system of more medical student graduates than slots, that's where this insane competitive nature comes. And it's always, when we have that system, it always is going to come down to the statistics of certain board scores, right?
Mm-hmm.
It sucks, but it kind of is what it is.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. We've been talking for 44 minutes, gentlemen. Anything else you want to share about your SOAP wild experience, advice you want to give for perhaps that person that's thinking this is their utmost fear walking into this?
I definitely would just say like, don't give up. I felt like going through my experience, I definitely thought like, oh, this is like the worst experience that anyone could go through. And now being somebody who has completed 1 year of residency and seen other people's experiences, like met like other residents who went through, didn't match and then went into TY programs who then, I've met people who didn't match, they didn't match in the match. They soaped into a TY program, went through the match again this past year, who then didn't match and either chose specialties that were not the specialties that they wanted, or some of them didn't match at all, who are then now doing, research years with the plans of applying again this upcoming year. I've definitely learned that there's people who have had a harder experience out there than I had. And so I would just encourage people, like if anyone out there feels like, the juice is worth the squeeze, then absolutely go all out for it. But unfortunately, the reality of it is like, I think there does need to be more education prior to people going into medicine about how competitive it is. Like you go into medical school, like, yeah, this is going to be hard. It's going to be competitive, but I certainly didn't know going into it. Like, yeah, I thought like, I'm not planning on being a neurosurgeon or a head and neck surgeon or like any of those things. But I did not go into it thinking like, oh, I might not be able to get into something like psychiatry or neurology or some of these other things that I find interesting. And so I think there needs to be more education up front about that, about just how competitive it is now, because I think it is way more competitive now than it was, 10, 20, 30 years ago.
And there's good data on why that is. I have there's an Instagram post from my my personal page that I guess I'll share and I'll tag on this. The number of medical school applicants have gone up like this, and if you can't see the image, Maybe think of a degree at like 60 degrees or so, fairly steep. And the medical residence spots have gone up at a much, much, much lower rate.
Mm-hmm.
So therefore, just like you're saying, it is getting more competitive. This is not a subjective thing. We're just saying, like, objectively, there's more applicants applying for these residency spots. We need to advocate for the government to get off their ass and pony up, because these residency spots are funded a lot by Medicare. Maybe there's a new approach where we need to get health insurance to front the bill a little bit. I don't know, because it shouldn't cost that much. Us residents don't get paid all that much. But yeah, it's just a bullshit system. So I think episodes like this are at least hopefully nudging this really tough situation in the right direction.
Yeah, because like the bottom line is every single year there's going to be people that graduate from med school that don't make it into to residency. And then they are left with the debt of medical school without the future income of a physician, an attending physician someday to help pay that off. And I think that there needs to be more discussion about that at the front end of it. And for the people that are at the back end of it, of like facing, like going up into the match, you know, like I said before, like if this is really what you want, then, you know, try and not let it get you down and keep at it. Cause I've heard stories of people who, you know, like I said, went through worse than what I went through and came out, you know, at least like getting to work in like the medical field. Maybe not what they wanted to do, but getting to do it. And it's something that people need to be aware of. Like if that's something that, if you go into med school and are not prepared to possibly not get to do what you want to do, then you need to be aware of that before going into med school, at least these days. Yeah.
It's the harsh reality.
Harsh reality. I think that's a sad but bitter place to end.
There. Dr. Paul Gray, everybody. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Cheers.